I regret saying some things I shouldn't have said,
Like?
like dead or alive, or bring them on. And by the way, my wife reminded me that, hey, as President of the United States, you better be careful what you say. I mean, I was trying to convey a message. I probably could have conveyed it more artfully. Being on this ship reminds me of when I went to the USS Abraham Lincoln, and they had a sign that said "Mission Accomplished." I regret that, that sign was there. It was a sign aimed at the sailors on that ship. However, it conveyed a broader knowledge. To some, it said, well, Bush thinks the war in Iraq is over, when I didn't think that, but nevertheless, it conveyed the wrong message. So there are things I've regretted.
But leading the United States into the war in Iraq, unfortunately, not one of those things that former President George W. Bush regrets. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Kim Brown Show. We are broadcasting live this morning from our studios in downtown Washington, D.C., also being heard very loud and clear in New York City, Miami. Good morning, Chicago. The phone lines are open. The number is 1-855-707-7887, 1-855-707-7887, or you can tweet me on Twitter at Kim Brown Talks. That was former President George W. Bush in an interview given in November of 2008 after the election of President Barack Obama, and he was asked about things that he regrets. And one of the big, huge facets of the Bush administration was the war in Iraq. And this morning, I have a very special guest in studio, Mr. Michael M. O'Brien. Michael is author of the book titled America's Failure in Iraq, Intervention to Withdrawal, 1991 to 2010. And he joins me in studio this morning. Michael, good morning.
Good morning. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you so much for being here. Michael, before we open and get into the discussion, if you could please, for the audience, give us your background and your credentials.
Well, I am a graduate of the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. I served in the infantry for 5 years after graduation. Served in the Canal Zone in Panama. I was there when Jimmy Carter turned the canal back, or the process started to turn the canal back to the Panamanian people. Then I went from there to the 2nd Infantry Division in Korea, served on the DMZ, and in Camp Casey, a little bit to the south for a year. Then I went to San Antonio, Texas, and was discharged from the Army. Went into sales, tried a couple of different things, and eventually got into commercial real estate, which I do as a career right now. I say that because at one point, back in the spring of 2006, I applied for a position. I answered not an advertisement, but I found out about a company that had folks in Iraq and Afghanistan, and I applied for a position that was, the job description, it was like it was written for me. And it was the real estate advisor to the Iraqi Ministry of Defense in Baghdad. And the reason they needed somebody with my skill actually was directly related to Paul Bremer having disbanded the Iraqi army. So it was being rebuilt all over again. And of course, if you have soldiers, you have to have a place for them to be based out of. So I was over there dealing with issues like land acquisition, construction, renovation of existing facilities, things that I'm, been doing for a long time. So that was the specific reason why I was over there, and I was there for 14 months, and now I'm back in commercial real estate back here in the States.
So you worked as a contractor for the Department of Defense. Is that accurate?
That is perfectly accurate. I was a DOD contractor. I worked for a company that was under a DOD contract to provide advisors and consultants to the Iraqi Ministry of Defense and other Iraqi ministries.
Now, obviously, September 11th, 2001, the United States was attacked by al-Qaeda here in Washington, New York City, and with a plane that went down outside of Shanksburg, Pennsylvania. However, in 2003, in President Bush's State of the Union address, he said this.
Today, the gravest danger in the war on terror, the gravest danger facing America and the world, is outlaw regimes that seek and possess nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons. These regimes could use such weapons for blackmail, terror, and mass murder. They could also give or sell those weapons to terrorist allies who would use them without the least hesitation. This threat is new. America's duty is familiar.
Later on in that same State of the Union address, he did go on to mention Iraq specifically. About a year and a half after 9/11, and we hear the president referencing Iraq. Obviously a big leap, considering that Iraq was not, or certainly did not claim responsibility for the 9/11 attacks. What were your thoughts when you heard the president begin to interject Iraq talk in his speeches?
When he started talking about Iraq, I was like, well, my initial gut reaction was, Saddam's a bad guy, and Iraq, and we never. And the other thing was, we never finished the job in 1991.
Explain that. What do you mean by that?
Well, that's the reason why I gave the book the subtitle, Intervention to Withdrawal 91 to 2010. The decision by Bush's father, George H.W. Bush, to end all hostile action in 1991 was, I feel, one of the worst decisions ever made by an American commander-in-chief. And the reason I say that is because, and I don't say that in hindsight. My book begins, the first page of it, I discussed that night when he made that announcement. I could not believe that we were stopping well on up the road on our way to Baghdad. I could not believe we were going to let Saddam Hussein remain in power. It simply made no sense to me at all. We had the mandate with his invasion of Kuwait to go over there and kick him out. We had 500,000 coalition troops over there at the time that could have handled anything that came their way. We were allowing this guy, this bad actor, Saddam Hussein, to remain in power, and it simply made no sense. And then we started hearing about all these, and one of the things that really got me was it was several months after the first President Bush ended hostilities that night. Was a Newsweek article discussing what had happened in the Oval Office, the day before and that day, where President George H.W. Bush consulted with Colin Powell and Norman Schwarzkopf and asked them for their opinion. And I'm reading this. I remember reading this Newsweek magazine, and I just was in disbelief. First of all, I'm going, why is the president asking these guys for their opinion? He's the commander-in-chief. And then I'm reading the article, and Colin Powell advises the president to cease hostilities, that the world will think ill of us if we keep going all the way to Baghdad and wipe out the Republican Guard. And I'm going, what is Colin Powell thinking? He's a career soldier. You win the war by vanquishing the enemy, wiping it out, and so that it can't do anything more. Every war that is decisively won, that's what happens. And Norman Schwarzkopf, according to the article, was ambivalent, caved, in my opinion, to Powell, and said, Mr. President, yeah, I agree with that. And I remember it was no sooner after the president announced the cessation of hostilities that Norman Schwarzkopf comes out and says, well, I really disagree with that, in so many words. I thought it was a bad idea. Well, hey, it's too late now, Norm. You had your chance. And then, of course, the president took Norman Schwarzkopf out behind a woodshed and straightened him out, and that was the end of that.
So do you feel as if the first Iraqi invasion by U.S. troops, obviously in defense of Kuwait, who had been invaded by Saddam Hussein, that the failure to remove Saddam at that time in 1991 was the beginning of our failures in that country?
Absolutely. And not only that, a good friend of mine who was a tank squadron commander over there in the Gulf War said that Norman Schwarzkopf's standing orders were to get Iraq out of Kuwait, turn around, and go to Baghdad and take out Saddam. That he was the commander of the operation. He was CENTCOM commander. Back in those days, they called it commander-in-chief. But he was a combatant field commander, and that was his standing orders to all of his troops in the Gulf War. He had every intention of getting Saddam out of Kuwait and then turning right around and going up to Baghdad and taking out the Saddam regime. And the thing about it is people say, well, the UN mandates, our mission was to get him out of Kuwait, and that was it. And that's what we were told by President Bush. Okay. And I say, well, then we should have gotten him out of Kuwait and stopped on the border of Kuwait and Iraq. Get him out of Kuwait and then stop there and turn off the engines of the tanks. But instead, we went through Iraq to get him out of Kuwait. So we entered Iraq to get him out of Kuwait. And then when he was out of Kuwait and heading, like a jackrabbit back to Baghdad, we were halfway to Baghdad. So we were in violation of the UN sanctions right out of the gate.
By invading Iraq, is that what you're saying? By
going through Iraq using Iraq as an invasion platform to get him out of Kuwait. So we were in Iraq. We were halfway to Baghdad after he got out of Kuwait. So we're already in violation of the sanctions.
So go all the way. Is that what you're suggesting?
So it will go all the way, not just for the sake of going all the way. Take out Saddam's regime and take out the Republican Guard, which was the best force Saddam had. It was 80,000 soldiers. I mean, would they stand up that well against the U.S. Army or anything? Probably not. Man to man, we'd probably wipe them out, but they were still a major, major threat in that part of the world. And we had them. We could have captured them, taken them prisoner. Colin Powell let them go. And we all know what happened after that.
Let's detour for a second. Do we know exactly when our relations with Iraq and Saddam Hussein began to deteriorate? Was it upon the invasion of Kuwait, or was it prior to that? Because we used Saddam as a check of power to sort of keep in check the Iranians.
Yep.
And we actually assisted Iraq during the Iran-Iraq war. So how did he go from someone that we supplied arms to and was trying to help defeat the Iranians to now someone who is on the president's target list?
Well, that's really an interesting point. As you said, we were, he was one of our friends in that part of the world. The invasion of Kuwait certainly was the thing. That was the straw that broke the camel's back. I don't know diplomatically. I don't know exactly when our relationship with Saddam Hussein started to go south. Mm-hmm. But there was a time before his invasion of Kuwait when he was a friend of ours, and of course he was. Any enemy of Iran is a friend of the United States. If we all know what happened. The hostage crisis and all that in the 70s. So the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So Saddam was our friend. But when he went into there was a former ambassador, U.S. ambassador to Kuwait, and I cannot recall the gentleman's name, but I was at a lecture that he gave a few years ago, and he said that it was simply no one even believed that Saddam would be foolish enough to invade Kuwait. Right up until the day he did it, nobody thought that he would be dumb enough. Because of what would happen, the consequences of what would happen, nobody would stand for it. And Saddam was just this guy, macho in the extreme, who wanted to flex muscles and run his, and run the show. And it was also a way, I think, by the Iran-Iraq war and the invasion of Kuwait. I believe it was also he's a dictator, so it's a way of solidifying his base. Keeping, if there's a war, he's got to have a strong army to fight the war. With a strong army, it eliminates threats to being overthrown. So these wars are a way of keeping his power base strong in his own country. And of course, I'm sure you probably know he had many look-alike doubles because he
feared assassination, right?
Absolutely, by his own people.
Okay. Well, listen, Michael, we need to take a very quick break. We're going to resume this conversation, and we're really just getting started, everybody, because the American involvement in Iraq literally now goes back decades. And I think it's very important for us to gain context and understanding to figure out how we got to where we were in 2003 when we initiated a grand invasion of Iraq and deposed Saddam Hussein, and then we were left to clean up the tremendous mess afterwards. I'm joined in studio with Michael M. O'Brien. He is the author of the book titled America's Failure in Iraq, Intervention to Withdrawal, 1991 to 2010. You're listening to The Kim Brown Show. Welcome back, everybody, to The Kim Brown Show. We are broadcasting live in D.C., New York, Miami, and Chicago. This morning, I have an in-studio guest, Mr. Michael M. O'Brien. He's author of the book titled America's Failure in Iraq. He's a former Department of Defense contractor. He was in Iraq for 14 months in the year 2006, and he saw a lot of things firsthand on the ground, and his book is in stores now. It is extremely in-depth and comprehensive. I would certainly suggest that you pick it up and check it out. Now, Michael, when we went to the break, we were talking about President George H.W. Bush, who, for reasons that are still not clear, decided to pull out of Baghdad or not to continue the march towards Baghdad to depose Saddam Hussein in 1991. So Saddam is allowed to remain in power from 1991 into 2001. And what was happening in Iraq during those 10 years?
Well, first of all, in that culture, the Middle Eastern culture is a tribal culture, and tribal culture, there's one boss, there's one man in charge, and Saddam was that guy, and he ruled by intimidation. We all know that, but he was allowed to remain alive and in power. So in that culture. And I saw this when I was over there in 2006 and 2007. In that culture, when I was in Iraq, there's murals and plaques and paintings and everything of Saddam wiping out U.S. forces because the people of Iraq were made to think that that's exactly what had happened because he was still alive and still in power. I mean, it's kind of illogical, and of course he controls all the information, so... Anyway, after we stopped in 91 and allowed him and the Republican Guard to remain intact, then we had the northern and southern no-fly zones.
What exactly does that mean?
It meant that Saddam was not allowed to fly aircraft, his own aircraft, into these zones. So they used parallels on a map. And they had, the North Kurdistan and the South, Basra and close to Kuwait. And he was, you are not allowed to fly your own aircraft, including helicopters. And I say that for a reason. I'll get to that in a second. Including helicopters north of this line or south of this line. And there's also the speech that President George H.W. Bush gave about to the Iraqi people. We encourage you to take matters into your own hands. In other words, basically saying, take out Saddam, and we'll be behind you 100%. If you guys do it, So they tried, and Saddam entered the no-fly zones, and was gassing his own people, murdering his own people, shooting out of helicopters, dropping gas canisters, wiping out Kurds to the north and Shiites to the south. He was a Sunni, so the Shiites were rallying to the south, and we did absolutely nothing. Norman Schwarzkopf did absolutely nothing, and allowed Saddam to fly helicopters into these no-fly zones and do what he did, and we did not stop him. So that was one of the things that Saddam was doing, and nothing happened to him. The other thing was these sanctions that were implemented by the UN. When I got there in July of 2006, the effects of the sanctions, excuse me, the Iraqi people were the only ones who suffered. Mm-hmm. It was a black market economy. You couldn't buy anything. You had to have connections to get anything. Corruption and bribery went through the roof. It was during this period that Saddam was building one palace after the next. He had about 21 palaces, which were all top rate. I was in several of them. Beautiful buildings. I actually was in the bathrooms that had the gold fixtures, solid gold fixtures in the bathrooms and stuff like that.
So it didn't sound like Saddam Hussein himself personally, or his family, or even likely his regime or his council of top advisors were suffering under these sanctions at all.
Dictators never suffer. The dictator lives high on the hog, while the citizens of that country, North Korea is another perfect example, suffer while the people suffer. So and then the weapons inspections. Hans Blix and all these other guys from the UN, they go over there, and one violation after the next. And Saddam is just basically thumbing his nose at everybody. So he's doing whatever he wants for 10, 11, 12 years. He's doing whatever he wants, and nobody's doing anything.
Well, during that time, do we know whether or not Saddam Hussein possibly either funded or participated or helped to orchestrate any terrorist attacks against the United States, especially on the homeland?
I'm not aware. I am not aware. I am not aware that Saddam was a big backer of Al Qaeda. He might have had some contact with Al Qaeda, but the fact we do know for a fact that Al Qaeda was based out of Afghanistan. Welcome guests of the Taliban regime. We know that. That's a fact, and that's why I state in my book, and I'll state right now, after 9/11, when we went into Afghanistan, that made perfect sense to me and still does today. But going into Iraq in 2003, there's a huge disconnect there. And I'm sure you're probably want to talk about that too.
Absolutely.
But we're kind of like in the in between the two wars kind of thing. Saddam was allowed to get away with what he did in 91, and was allowed to just do whatever he wanted from 91 to 2000 and 2000, 2001, 2003, 2002. I mean.
And 2003 is where we really saw the selling of Saddam Hussein is a dangerous threat to American security, and the urgency in which the Bush administration was seeking to inform or misinform, depending on your perspective, the American people about Saddam Hussein's arsenal and his intentions was undoubtedly being heard at this George Bush press conference, George W. Bush, president that is, in February of 2003.
The Secretary of State has now briefed the United Nations Security Council on Iraq's illegal weapons programs, its attempts to hide those weapons, and its links to terrorist groups. I want to thank Secretary Powell for his careful and powerful presentation of the facts.
Well, and Secretary of State, the former Secretary of State at the time, Colin Powell, just gave his presentation to the United Nations about what the American intelligence viewed as evidence that Saddam Hussein was manufacturing chemical weapons, that he had these mobile sites that were mobile and moving and difficult to track, but we know that he's got them. And what were your thoughts about Colin Powell's now infamous presentation to the United Nations about what the United States intelligence believed that Saddam Hussein was in possession of?
Well, I have to say, you mentioned a moment ago the sales job, okay? And if I may, I've been in sales. I've been a salesman in my career, and I was trained as a new salesman. I was selling surgical instruments when I got out of the Army in 1982, and one of the things that they taught us was create the need. Create the need. So what meaning, before you knocked on the door, the client that you want to sell to had no idea that they needed your product. But by the time you're done, they can't live without it. Well, that's exactly what we got from the Bush administration. They created the need for an invasion of Iraq in 2003, and a key participant in that scenario was Colin Powell. And I am not a fan of Colin Powell. And the reason I am not is because he is one of a couple of common denominators of both wars. We just talked about him at the end of the Gulf War in 91. And in my opinion, he was still wearing a uniform back then, but he was really trying to be a diplomat and a politician. He should have waited until he took the uniform that with 4 stars on his shoulders off before he started getting into politics. The job of a military man is to destroy the enemy. He did not do his job in 91. So fast forward to March of 2003, when he is, goes up there to the UN. He was grabbing at anything he could find right up to the night before he flew up to New York to try and get anything that would justify him going up there in front of the Security Council and making the case for invading Iraq. I remember watching his appearance, and he's got a little vial of something which I heard later was not real. Okay, it was like a phony. It was fake.
It was a prop.
It was a prop. But I also remember the one thing that sticks out in my mind, I remember it vividly, was he's playing an audio of a couple of Iraqi military officers, and he makes this big thing about, I have made the decision to declassify this audio recording so that, because it's so important that you hear these 2 officers talk about this weapon. So you hear these 2 Iraqi officers going back and forth in Arabic, and it's being translated, and it's a weapon. They're talking about some weapon, and that's it. They could have been talking about a pea shooter. I mean, I'm like, that is proving the case for invading Iraq.
I watched his presentation live because they showed it live on television, and I remember seeing the aerial pictures of the supposed aluminum tubings, or this aluminum.
The infamous aluminum tubes.
Right. And I'm thinking to myself, sir, I don't see anything. Like, maybe perhaps I don't have a defensive eye trained to spot chemicals and weapons of mass destruction, but that to me just looks like some tubes. So, Michael, during the course of President Bush's, the same press conference actually, where he's referencing Colin Powell's speech to the United Nations, he made some very, let's just say, some statements that were a bit of a reach.
One of the greatest dangers we face is that weapons of mass destruction might be passed to terrorists who would not hesitate to use those weapons. Saddam Hussein has long-standing, direct, and continuing ties to terrorist networks. Senior members of Iraqi intelligence and al-Qaeda have met at least 8 times since the early 1990s. Iraq has sent bomb-making and document forgery experts to work with al-Qaeda. Iraq has also provided al-Qaeda with chemical and biological weapons training.
Michael, obviously we have the benefit of hindsight in this being 10 years after the fact. Was any of that true?
The bulk of it, from everything I've been able to gather, the bulk of it is really unsubstantiated. There may have been times when, they were grabbing at straws. I mean, I can't say without a doubt that none of it was true or all of it was true, but I can say this. In hindsight, as you just said, when George Tenet, the director of Central Intelligence, said to President Bush prior to the invasion, and we've all heard this, he said, and Bob Woodward wrote about this in his book, and I quote him in my book, "Mr. President, it's a slam dunk that Saddam Hussein possesses weapons of mass destruction." So the case I make in my book is this. With the intelligence capability, with the intelligence gathering capability that the United States supposedly possesses, the Central Intelligence Agency, the National Security Agency, the Defense Intelligence Agency, etc. There's like 17 intelligence agencies of the United States government. How is it possible that the Director of Central Intelligence, George Tenet, can make that statement, and then we get over there and we can't find anything? People say, well, he moved it all. He destroyed it all. Saddam. This, that, and the next thing.
He moved it to Syria.
Moved it to Syria. How do you do that without having absolute proof positive that he actually did that? And see, here's the thing. During the Clinton administration, Bill Clinton watered down our human intelligence capability. He watered it down because he said, well, you know, we don't want to be in the business of dealing with shady characters. Well, how do you, I mean, my God, I mean, that's what people in that line of work do, deal with shady characters. And here's another thing too. Curveball was the infamous name given to the guy that the United States was basing all of this on. He was an Iraqi national. He was he was being detained by German intelligence, and he was saying Saddam's got WMD. I've been there. I've seen it. Blah blah blah. Fact: George Tenet, head of CIA, would not send his own interrogators over to Germany to talk to this guy because he didn't want to ruffle the Germans' feathers. He didn't want German intelligence to be upset. So he was taking the word of this guy, Curveball, that was the nickname, the name they gave him for security reasons. Whatever he was telling German intelligence was passing what they wanted onto the CIA. That was the main reason why we were saying Saddam had WMD. None of our own people ever saw anything.
Michael, we heard a lot of passing the buck about, the British intelligence also got it wrong, and this other ally of ours, their intelligence also got it wrong. So it's not exactly our fault that our intelligence botched this information about weapons of mass destruction that Saddam Hussein allegedly possessed, and we still have not found. But we have to take a break right now. You're listening to The Kim Brown Show. We are speaking with Michael M. O'Brien. He is the author of the book, America's Failure in Iraq. Y'all stick around.
The United States would welcome and support a new resolution which makes clear that the Security Council stands behind its previous demands. Yet resolutions mean little without resolve. And the United States, along with a growing coalition of nations, is resolved to take whatever action is necessary to defend ourselves and disarm the Iraqi regime. September the 11th, 2001. The American people saw what terrorists could do by turning 4 airplanes into weapons. We will not wait to see what terrorists or terrorist states could do with chemical, biological, radiological, or nuclear weapons. Saddam Hussein can now be expected to begin another round of empty concessions, transparently false denials. No doubt, he will play a last-minute game of deception. The game is over.
Welcome back to the Kim Brown Show, live down here in Washington, New York, Chicago, and Miami. Of course, that was President George W. Bush at a press conference in 2003, February of 2003, where he made somewhat of a link between Saddam Hussein and the attacks that happened to us on 9/11. This morning, Michael O'Brien joins us in studio. He's the author of the book called America's Failure in Iraq, Intervention to Withdrawal, 1991 to 2010. Now, Michael, in that press conference, obviously that's February of 2003, the selling of Saddam Hussein as possibly seeking to attack Americans on the homeland was ramped up and ready to go. So When did Congress give the approval for this president to go ahead with the invasion?
Well, listening to President Bush just a moment ago, the way he delivered it, and the sincerity in his voice, and all the things that he said, if everything that he said was actually true, it'd be a hard time to refute him. But what he was also talking about was that preemptive strike initiative of his. We're not going to wait. And I remember when all the voting was going on in the Senate, and I remember reading about one U.S. senator, and I cannot remember his name, right around this time when the votes were being in Congress for the invasion, to support the invasion or to allow the president to do this. One U.S. senator said, I believe he was a Republican, and he said, why can't we just wait for Saddam to do something? Why are we doing this? Why are we going in preemptively? And I remember it rang a bell with me. But he did get, answer your question, he did get the votes, and I think a lot of the Democrats in Congress who voted for him, if you were to look at their vote and how close they were to re-election, you would probably, I don't know for a fact, see a high correlation of the closer they were to re-election, the higher their probability, these are Democrats, of voting for the war so that they could look tough on terrorism and big on national defense.
Well, the interesting thing is that then Senator from New York, Hillary Rodham Clinton, did vote in favor of this war, but the junior senator from Illinois at the time, Barack Obama, did not. So that's true. I want to make that distinction. That
is true. But also another one is John Edwards, who voted for it. I believe he did. But then the one I was John Kerry. John Kerry, who said, I voted for it, but then I voted against it, and all that other kind of thing in the 2004 presidential campaign. So, but he got the support of Congress. The bottom line is, President Bush got the support of Congress to do this, and that of course gets to another constitutional question of the only entity who can declare war is the Congress. The president does not have the authority. Only Congress can pass an act of war, a war resolution. So Bush kind of like cut corners when he got their backing, but he did.
And Congress allowed him to do this.
They acquiesced, and I mention in my book the Tonkin Gulf Resolution in 1964, and there are very real similarities between this and 2003, between the two, where President Johnson, Lyndon Johnson, did the same thing. It is a fact that the Tonkin Gulf incident did not happen. It was fabricated.
And this led up to the war in Vietnam.
And he used this to get the Senate to allow him to send troops to Vietnam. And only 2 senators out of 100 voted against it. And see, that's the thing. It was not a declaration of war, and only Congress can vote for a declaration of war and authorize the president. And when we went to Vietnam, and when we did this again in 2003 in Iraq, the United States was not at war. We do all of this stuff without a declaration of war, which is a violation of the Constitution.
Michael, in the interest of time, because we are running short on time, I did want to talk about your experience in Iraq. By the time that you landed there in 2006, we had been there almost 2 years, I believe, or a little over 2 years.
A little over three.
What did you find when you got to Iraq? What was the state of the country, and what was the state of our military at that time?
Well, I was an advisor, a DoD Department of Defense advisor to the Iraqi Ministry of Defense. There were advisors, there were civilians, there was military. 99% of the military was U.S. There were contingents of British and Australian and New Zealand troops. Other than that, you could count on the fingers of one hand the number of troops. One country was Mongolia. They had about 10. But anyway,
that was our coalition, right?
That was the coalition of the willing.
Of the willing, right.
And I get over there, and my job, as I mentioned earlier, was to advise the Iraqi Ministry of Defense on construction, basing, land-related issues. And I found right after I got there, I started asking questions, and I had to deal with American military personnel who were essentially engineers, acting as engineers, doing construction and this and that for the Iraqi Ministry of Defense. And I started asking questions, and the more questions I asked about, because frankly, my client was the Ministry of Defense. So on behalf of my client, the Iraqi Ministry of Defense, I would ask the coalition that was doing all the stuff that they were doing basic questions about, how they were constructing these facilities, how they were acquiring the land, and stuff like that. And they wouldn't even talk to me. And I'm like, well, wait a minute. I thought I was a subject matter expert, SME. And I'm like being ignored. And then I'm going, well, why am I here? And then I started seeing, so that's, what was happening to me personally. But then I started seeing, the more time I spent there, the more just a mess the whole country was. It was just terrible. I was in what was called the international zone, which was formerly called the Green Zone. We've all heard of the Green Zone. Well, when I got over there, its name had been changed. So we called it the IZ for short, International Zone. And you did not leave the International Zone. You did not leave it unless you were flying in a helicopter or in an armed convoy. It was death. And I mean that literally if you walked out the gate. So
it was death for Westerners, for Americans?
There were Iraqis who were working inside the international zone who were being murdered every day, and their pictures would be pasted on the walls in the hallways of the Ministry of Defense building. No Iraqi could tell their next-door neighbor what they were doing for a living. If you told your neighbor, the neighbor could tell an insurgent, and they'd take you out in the middle of the night and kill you.
Just a contrast, if we could, for a second, because no one here is defending Saddam Hussein or his regime or his dictatorship, etc. However, everyday life for the people of Iraq during his rule was significantly better than it was after him being deposed.
There's no doubt about it. I worked with Iraqis every day. As you said, no one will dispute that Saddam was a bad dude. If you kept your nose clean, if you did not stand on a corner and say, down with Saddam, if you did that, you're dead. I mean, you didn't. Your life expectancy was about 5 minutes. But if you kept your nose clean, you lived a normal life. And I'm not saying that's good. But how many Iraqis are dead as a result of our invasion of 2003? I will tell you at least 500,000. I mean, it has to be around. It's got to be about 500,000 people. Saddam Hussein never killed 500,000 of his own people. That I can tell you, he never did. And the thing that got Saddam Hussein hung from a rope was he was found guilty of the death of about 40 people in some village. That was what they found him guilty of. I mean, that was the only thing they could pin directly on Saddam to get him to hang from the end of a rope. So here we are, we go over there in 2003. Saddam was not invading a neighbor or a direct threat to the United States. But we went over there anyway. Now, in 91, he was a threat to a neighbor, Kuwait. And in the president's in the clips that you've played, where the president says, we are not going to wait. Well, wait for what? curveball I mentioned before. It turns out it all came out in the news about 2 years ago. He made it all up. The guy that was being detained by German intelligence,
the Iraqi informant,
yeah,
giving the American military or the American intelligence or the German intelligence, which cherry-picked the information to the American intelligence,
who George Tenet never sent his own people over to personally interview. That's the same curveball. He admitted he made it all up because he didn't like Saddam, and he was the single main, quote, source of intelligence of Saddam's WMD capability, which George Tenet claimed was a slam dunk.
Michael, how much did the Iraq war cost?
We can't even begin to calculate. We have figures of about $6 billion that are gone, disappeared.
Is that the $6 billion in cash? That maybe I'm thinking of a separate incident, but there was an incident in which a trough
pallet load of cash.
That's right.
It was pallets of cash on Air Force transports. Pallets of cash from the Federal Reserve Bank in New Jersey, flown out of, I guess, MacDill on C-140 or C-5 transports and C-17 transports. Pallets of U.S. cash. And the stuff was walking away in suitcases, walking away. There were no controls, no nothing. And I'll tell you. And when we went over there in 2003. So we went over there with lousy intelligence. We went over there preemptively. We didn't wait for him to do anything first. And it's like two kids fighting in a schoolyard. Whoever throws the first punch is the one who's guilty. We threw the first punch. Then we invade with a fraction of the troops needed to invade a country the size of half the eastern seaboard of the United States, and then Paul Bremer disbands the Iraqi army and their national police. So now all these soldiers and policemen are out of a job with a weapon and with ammunition and are ripe picking for the insurgency over there. If Al-Qaeda was not involved in 9/11, Al-Qaeda is all over Iraq now because they hate America and they swarmed into Iraq after we invaded in 2003 to kill Americans because that's what they like to. That's part of their portfolio. Let's kill Americans. And then I get over there and I'm an advisor to the Ministry of Defense and I see all this stuff that's going on. And you want to talk about, in my book, I have pictures of an Iraqi camp that was built by an American contractor. And the conditions of this camp were so pathetic. I took pictures of it, and it was it was like 6 months old or a year old. This camp, this construction, and I asked the base commander or the deputy commander of this Iraqi base. I can't remember, or it might have been an American contractor. I'm sorry. I said, "What did we pay for this?" And he said, $116 million.
I'm sorry. Say that for me one more time. $116 million for a shoddy?
116 with the letter M after it.
For a shoddy facility.
It was it's so bad. Pictures can describe how bad this was, and my jaw dropped just like yours did just now. And this is just one camp, one contract, one American company. The money that is being made. Then the old expression, military-industrial complex, pops up. And all the money that's being made by defense contractor, I'm not against defense. Not at all. I graduated from West Point. I was an officer in the Army. Why would I be against defense? But national defense of the United States. What did the invasion of Iraq in 2003 have to do with the defense of the United States of America? And I will submit, not a thing.
But I did want to say absolutely money was made hand over fist. And unfortunately, in addition to the Iraqi civilians, as we estimate 500,000 or so lost their lives, over 5,000 of our U.S. men and women service people also lost their lives, and some of them in industrial incidents. I can recall, I think it was 5 U.S. soldiers who were electrocuted in a shower that was for some shoddy construction. And all these figures are simply mind-blowing. Really quickly, Michael, before we part, I wanted to ask you, How much of Iraq is going to be tied to President George W. Bush's legacy?
Well, his father has gotten a pass for the abysmal way he ended the conflict in '91. If you looked at the presidency, the 8 years that George W. Bush was president, if everything were remaining exactly the same, but Iraq never happened, what could we say? Well, then it would be, the deficit and spending, or, this or that. But that one single thing, the invasion of Iraq, defines his presidency. There's no question about it. If he hadn't invaded Iraq, if he had gone into Afghanistan, which was going great, and kept up the pressure on the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, and really kept a lid on Afghanistan, and which of course went down the tubes because we went into Iraq, and then look what happened in Afghanistan after that. But if he had not invaded Iraq, people wouldn't like him, but they wouldn't have liked him anyway. People that don't like Bush, or if a person's a Democrat, they don't like the vice versa. We all know that.
And what is your political affiliation, really quickly? I
used to be a Republican. I am not. I am a conservative. The Republican Party does not represent me anymore. Mm-hmm. But I am a conservative. I love my country and I love the Constitution, and that is my political belief.
Well, I certainly appreciate you taking the time to come and speak with me, Michael. You certainly have written an in-depth, comprehensive, honest accounting of our failure in Iraq. The name of the book is called America's Failure in Iraq, Intervention to Withdrawal, 1991 to 2010. The author, Michael M. O'Brien, in studio with me today. Michael, I so appreciate your time today. Thank you.